The crack echoes through the cabin. My son's arm hits the floor. Not his arm. His prosthetic. The sound is wrong. Plastic and carbon fiber snapping like a dry branch. 20 rows go silent. A woman in a cobalt blue blazer stands over him, chest heaving. "That thing was blocking my armrest," she says. My son's face goes white. He served 2 tours. He lost that arm in a place I still cannot say out loud. Now a stranger has broken what the government took 11 months to build for him. My hands are shaking. Not from fear. I know exactly who I am. She does not. "Get it out of the aisle." She snaps at a flight attendant, kicking the broken piece with her sneaker. My son reaches for it, trembling, humiliated in front of 40 strangers. I have spent 30 years learning when to speak and when to wait. This is not the moment to speak. Not yet. But somewhere over Ohio at 31,000 feet, this woman has just made a mistake she cannot take back. But to understand why this moment changed everything, I need to take you back to where this all began. My name is Elena Castillo Reyes. I am 58 years old, and for most of my adult life, very few people outside a small circle of officials in Washington have known what I actually do for a living. That morning, I was simply a mother. My son Marcus was flying home from a VA rehabilitation clinic in Tampa, where he had spent 3 weeks adjusting to a new prosthetic arm after complications with his previous one. Marcus lost his right arm below the elbow during his second deployment, a roadside explosion that took 2 of his friends and nearly took his life. He does not talk about it much. He does not need to. I see it every time he flinches at a loud noise, every time he catches himself reaching for something with a hand that is no longer there. That day, I flew down to bring him home myself, because some things a mother does regardless of rank or title. The cabin that morning felt ordinary. Recycled air, the smell of weak coffee, the low hum of the engines settling into cruising altitude. Passengers scrolled on their phones. A toddler 2 rows back babbled happily to her mother. Marcus sat by the window, quiet, proud, exhausted from 3 weeks of physical therapy that had finally given him something close to independence again. My goal that day was simple: get my son home safely, help him settle back into his apartment, and return to my regular schedule by Monday morning. The badge clipped inside my jacket pocket felt heavier than usual that morning, though I could not have told you why. Before boarding, everything had been calm. Ordinary. The kind of quiet you only recognize in hindsight, once you know what is coming to break it. She boarded during final call, moving down the aisle like she owned every square foot of the aircraft. Early 50s, blindingly white teeth, a cobalt blue blazer with matching trousers, the kind of outfit that costs more than most people's monthly rent and is worn specifically so everyone notices. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painful. Gold jewelry caught the cabin lights every time she moved her wrist, which was often, because she moved her wrist constantly, gesturing at the flight attendants like she was conducting an orchestra of people beneath her. Her name, we would later learn, was Deborah Whitlock Ashford, though at that moment she was simply the woman blocking the aisle, arguing about overhead bin space with a flight attendant half her age. "I always get priority boarding," she said, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Do you know who my husband is?" The flight attendant, a young man named Theo, kept his composure, gently explaining the overhead bins were full. Deborah rolled her eyes so hard I worried she might sprain something. This was the small incident, the seemingly minor moment that meant nothing to anyone else on that plane. But it told me everything I needed to know about who she was before she ever said another word. Then her eyes moved past Theo, scanning the cabin, searching for her assigned seat. And they landed on Marcus. I watched her expression shift, the way a predator's does when it spots something smaller. Oh no, I thought. She noticed him. Deborah's seat was directly across the aisle from Marcus, and within 90 seconds of sitting down, she was staring at his prosthetic arm resting on the shared armrest between their seats. "Can you move that?" she said, not asking, ordering. Marcus, calm and practiced after years of managing awkward reactions to his arm, gently explained that his prosthetic needed to rest in a neutral position, and he would try to keep it compact. That should have been the end of it. Any reasonable person would have nodded and returned to their phone. Deborah did not. "I didn't pay for a seat next to a science experiment," she said, loud enough that the row in front of us turned around. A flight attendant approached to check if everything was fine, and Deborah waved her off with the practiced entitlement of someone who has never once faced a real consequence in her life. "We're fine," she snapped, though nothing about the situation was fine at all. Marcus's shoulders tensed, but he said nothing further, simply adjusted his arm as much as physically possible and turned toward the window. I sat one row back, watching my son absorb another small cruelty with the same quiet dignity he has shown since the day he came home from that hospital in Germany. My internal monologue was loud even as my face stayed calm. I have negotiated with foreign officials who wanted to test my patience. I have sat across tables from people who wanted war instead of peace. I chose, in that moment, the same restraint I have used my entire career. I chose peace, even as something inside me quietly recorded every word. 20 minutes into the flight, Deborah's irritation curdled into something uglier. She leaned across the aisle toward Marcus, uninvited, and pointed at his arm. "That thing looks fake," she said. "Is it even real? Or is this some kind of sympathy prop for attention?" A few passengers gasped audibly. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level, explaining quietly that it was a myoelectric prosthesis, custom-built after his injury in service. Deborah barked out a laugh that had no warmth in it at all. "Well, someone should have told you veterans get special seating," she said, loud enough for 3 rows to hear. "Not regular seats next to real passengers." The word real landed like a slap. An older man across the aisle leaned forward and said quietly, "Ma'am, that's enough." Deborah rounded on him instead, redirecting her fury like a weapon she could point anywhere. "Mind your own business," she snapped. A young woman near the front had already lifted her phone, filming quietly, her face a mixture of disbelief and disgust. Most passengers around us were now visibly siding with Marcus, throwing sympathetic glances his way, whispering to each other. Deborah, sensing she was losing her audience, only grew louder, reaching across the narrow aisle and shoving at the prosthetic arm resting on the shared rest. "Move. Now," she said, each word its own sentence, each one sharper than the last. Then came the false victory, the moment that made everything before it feel small. A flight attendant, pressured by Deborah's escalating volume and worried about disrupting the cabin further, asked Marcus if he would mind moving to a middle seat 2 rows back, just for the remainder of the flight. It was not fair. It was not right. But it was the path of least resistance for an overworked crew trying to keep the peace at 30,000 feet. Marcus, ever gracious, ever patient after years of learning to pick his battles, quietly agreed, gathering his bag with his one good hand while Deborah smirked from her seat like she had won a war instead of humiliated a wounded veteran. I felt something cold settle into my chest, watching my son stand, watching him swallow yet another injustice quietly because that is what he has always done. The other passengers watched too, and I could feel the collective outrage building in the cabin like pressure before a storm. Deborah leaned back into her seat, satisfied, victorious, utterly unaware of what she had just set into motion. And that was the moment I decided Deborah had made the last mistake of her very comfortable life. Marcus never made it to the new seat. As he stood in the narrow aisle, prosthetic arm extended slightly for balance, Deborah reached out one final time, this time not to shove the arm aside but to grab it, wrenching it hard enough that the socket separated from the mount with a sharp, sickening crack. The prosthetic clattered to the floor, rolling under a seat. The cabin went utterly silent. Marcus stood frozen, staring down at the broken piece of himself lying on airplane carpet. His face a mixture of shock and a pain that had nothing to do with his missing limb and everything to do with dignity. "That thing was blocking my armrest," Deborah said, as if this explained anything at all, as if broken carbon fiber and 11 months of rehabilitation could be dismissed with a sentence. I stood up. My breathing was controlled, measured, the way I have trained myself to breathe in rooms far more dangerous than this one. I stepped into the aisle and looked directly at Deborah, and for the first time since boarding, I spoke. "Ma'am, you need to sit down and stop talking," I said, quiet, calm, final. Deborah turned toward me, taking in my plain gray blazer, my ordinary appearance, and laughed. "And who do you think you are?" she said. I reached into my jacket pocket, the one that had felt heavier than usual all morning, and withdrew a small leather case. Inside it sat a federal credential most people never see up close in their entire lives. I held it open at eye level, steady. "My name is Elena Castillo Reyes," I said quietly. "I am the Secretary of Defense of the United States." The cabin did not gasp so much as inhale, one collective breath drawn in at the same moment. A phone lowered somewhere behind me. Someone whispered, "Oh my God," so softly it barely registered as sound. Deborah's face began to change, the confident smirk sliding off in real time, replaced first by confusion, then disbelief, then something close to horror as the reality of what she had just done settled into her expression like ice water. That can't be," she stammered, her hands fluttering uselessly. "I didn't know, I would never have." I cut her off with a single sentence. "You broke my son's prosthetic arm in front of 40 witnesses," I said. "Nothing you say next will change what everyone here just watched." An older gentleman near the front spoke the words everyone else was thinking. "She just assaulted a disabled veteran," he said, loud and clear. "And it's all on video." The captain, informed by the crew of the disturbance, requested law enforcement meet the aircraft upon landing, standard protocol regardless of who was involved. Though this time the details radioed ahead carried unusual weight. I briefed the responding officers myself once we touched down, calm and precise, laying out exactly what had occurred, the assault, the destroyed medical equipment, the pattern of escalating harassment toward a combat veteran. 3 separate passengers, including the young woman who had filmed from the start, stepped forward to provide their footage without being asked twice. Deborah attempted one final defense as officers approached her row. "He was taking up space," she said, her voice cracking, desperate now, reaching for justifications that had abandoned her the moment her hands touched Marcus's arm. "It did not work. Ma'am, you are being detained for assault and destruction of property," the lead officer said, his voice carrying through the now quiet cabin. The airline's regional manager, waiting at the gate, confirmed within minutes that Deborah was permanently banned from every flight the airline operated worldwide. The passengers around us broke into something between applause and stunned murmuring as she was escorted off. No longer cobalt blue confident, no longer commanding, simply a woman being walked down a jet bridge in handcuffs while everyone she had humiliated watched in silence. Marcus, sitting beside me, finally let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 20 minutes. His eyes were wet, not from pain, but from something like relief mixed with a dignity finally restored in front of strangers who had witnessed his humiliation and now witnessed his vindication in equal measure. The cabin felt different once she was gone, lighter somehow, as though the air pressure itself had changed. Passengers who had been silent witnesses now leaned forward, offering Marcus quiet words of gratitude and respect, a few extending hands he could not fully shake but appreciated anyway. The older gentleman who had spoken up earlier crossed the aisle and knelt slightly beside Marcus's seat. "Son, thank you for your service," he said, his voice thick. "And I'm sorry it took something like this for people to see it." Marcus nodded, quiet, overwhelmed in the good way for once. I sat beside him, checking on him the way only a mother can, my hand resting gently on his shoulder, while airline staff carefully bagged the broken prosthetic pieces for evidence and insurance purposes. He looked at me, exhausted but steady, and said only, "I didn't need you to save me, Mom." I told him he was right. He didn't. He had handled every moment with more grace than I could have managed at his age. I had simply made sure the world finally saw what he had been enduring quietly for years. That evening, watching him settle into his childhood bedroom for a few nights of rest before returning to his own apartment, I understood something I had known intellectually for years but never felt quite this sharply. Titles and authority mean very little in daily life. What matters is how you treat people when you believe no one with power is watching. In the months that followed, Deborah Whitlock Ashford faced formal charges of assault and destruction of property, charges that carried real weight once federal attention became involved, regardless of my own preference to stay out of the legal process beyond my witness statement. Her husband, a regional bank executive, quietly resigned from 2 community boards after local news outlets picked up the story, the video footage circulating widely enough that anonymity was no longer an option for either of them. Marcus received a new prosthetic within 3 weeks, this time with expedited support from the VA, and something unexpected emerged from the publicity, a wave of donations and awareness for veterans navigating prosthetic care and public misunderstanding of their equipment. He has since spoken at 2 events for wounded veterans, sharing his story not for sympathy but to advocate for basic decency in public spaces. As for me, I returned to my regular responsibilities the following Monday, back behind closed doors and classified briefings, an entirely different world from a narrow airplane aisle. But I carry that day with me still, a reminder that dignity is not something granted by rank or title. It is something we choose to give each other or choose to take away every single day. And now, months later, when people ask me about that flight, I tell them the same thing every time. Some people mistake quiet patience for weakness. They see calm and assume there will never be consequences. But the loudest, most entitled voice in the room is rarely the most powerful one. Sometimes the person you humiliated without a second thought is the one holding the authority to make sure you never forget what you did. Real strength does not need to announce itself until the exact moment it matters. If this story reminded you that dignity always finds its way back to the people who deserve it, you already know what that means for how you treat others tomorrow.